There isn't a Hamilton Crescent, is there?
No, there was a Hamilton Crescent in the mid-19th century, and indeed it was in the 1850s that this ground started. Two clubs played at the ground in those days. Clutha played on the northern half of the ground, nearer the pavilion, and on the southern half there was a club called Royal. In 1862, they thought, particularly the Clutha members, they ought to get together and form a bigger club. And so with the help of some Glasgow businessmen, particularly Colonel Buchanan, who was instrumental in early Scottish cricket, they got together in George Square in Glasgow and formed a club. As they had great aspirations, they called the club West of Scotland. And so it was that West of Scotland Cricket Club came into being at this ground in 1862. They quickly became inroads. They were very successful. They were the club of the West of Scotland, and they operated very much like the Surrey Club did in England. And they made sure that they got lots of sporting fixtures at this ground, not just cricket. The first game of note was in 1868, when the full Scotland team played Birkenhead Park, a very good team from England. It was the first time Scotland, as a cricket team, had played in Scotland. Unfortunately, they were well beaten, but it was a learning process. However, far more reaching was in November 1872, when the West of Scotland Cricket Club persuaded the footballers of the area to have a football game. And here it was, the first ever recognised football international in the world was played at Hamilton Crescent. It was Scotland against England, and it led to the formation of the Scotland Football Association 1 year later. It was a pretty boring 0-0 draw, but the ramifications of that game can be seen on our TVs every night.
But it wasn't the only sport other than cricket to be played at Hamilton Crescent, was it?
No, indeed it wasn't. Rather surprisingly, hockey isn't a game associated with Hamilton Crescent, but there was a hockey international played here in 1921, Scotland against England, and 4 rugby internationals were also played here. It was a regular rugby ground. West of Scotland Rugby Club used this ground every weekend during the rugby season until the Second World War, and after a bit of a fallout with the Cricket Club Committee, they moved to their own ground. So there you have it. It is being used for football, hockey, rugby and cricket. They
thought of themselves as the MCC of Scotland at Hamilton Crescent, didn't they?
Yes, they did, on an ongoing basis. The first Australian tourists arrived here in 1878, and it was to Hamilton Crescent they were persuaded to come to play against 12 from West of Scotland. And West of Scotland organised games on a continuing basis. When the current Scottish Cricket Union came into being in 1909, West, I think, were a bit reluctant to toe the line, and they still organised their games. In fact, there was a major fallout in 1921 when again they arranged for Australia to come and visit Hamilton Crescent. The organiser was one George Beattie, an Australian, and a typically assertive Australian he was. So when the Scottish Cricket Union approached the Australian team to see if they wanted to play in Glasgow, the Australians said it was all been organised by George Beattie, and so they played here. There was lots of questions asked at the SCU AGM. It took a while before everyone kissed and made up.
Meanwhile, West had undertaken quite a number of tours of their own south of the border.
Yes, indeed. One of my earlier videos we spoke about Leslie Balfour Melville, but a second place would certainly go to Stuart Carrick, a tremendous batsman who also bowled some medium pace. And it was on a tour of the south of England where he made 419 not out in 1885 at Priory Park, Chichester. It was the world record score at the time. Nobody had made more, and the Victorians were besotted by high scores, and he held that high score for several years before it was beaten. A couple of scorecards I've got here are very interesting. They're 2 of the earliest scorecards we have. This one is of a Scotland-New Zealand game in 1937, one of the first trips that New Zealand had made to Scotland. And Scotland didn't fare too badly. They made 237 in their first innings. N.S. Mitchell-Innes made 87. It was his only appearance for Scotland, and he went on to be the oldest player who ever played for Scotland and the oldest player who ever played for England until his recent death. And there it was, his one appearance for Scotland, 1937 at this ground. An even later game was in 1945 when the Royal Australian Air Force came to play a Scotland 11. It wasn't an official game, we hadn't got back on that footing, but it was the equivalent of the victory test for Scotland. And then if I open up this scorecard, we can see that the legendary Keith Miller was one of the players. Another player with great associations for Scotland was also in the Royal Australian Air Force team. That was Stan Sizemore. He was a great wicket-keeper. He played first-class cricket for New South Wales. He also became the professional at Clydesdale, and he also played one game for Scotland. So there you have it, 2 scorecards from 2 great occasions.
Well, there may have been many international cricket matches played at Hamilton Crescent, but in fact not many Scotland victories here.
No, it's extraordinary. In fact, there wasn't many Scotland victories anywhere, so perhaps not too surprising, but this was a particularly unfortunate ground for them. I already mentioned they played that first game in 1868, but it was 1961 before they achieved a victory, and that was against Denmark, one of their weaker opponents, obviously. However, since then, there's been some great games here. I particularly recall scoring a game in 1992 against Hampshire. It was rather gloomy in the evening, and David Gower rather reluctantly came out to the wicket. He was bowled first of all by Peter Duthie, and the umpires promptly took us off immediately. And even more recently, in 2003, there was a game against Pakistan. It certainly wasn't gloomy that day, it was red hot, lovely sunshine. Rahul Dravid was playing his first game for Scotland, and guess what? He was out first ball. However, Scotland came very close to beating Pakistan. In fact, they only lost by 1 wicket.
Johnny Williams, Gold Century, 79, Western Scotland, 170 for 4. Voting with the last ball of the Western Scotland innings in this White and Mackay Scottish Cup final.
Morning. I'll take this off you. I'll give you this. I don't know what all I have got. But I've done all the thousands.
Final over the match to be bowled for Western Scotland by Colin Mayer.
The Western Scotland club, very historic, very ancient. Why aren't they hosting more international games now?
Size does matter, and there is certain dimensions you have to have for a one-day international, and that has been the problem here. Behind me you can see it is a very short boundary to the pavilion. It doesn't meet the required standard for a one-day international, and it has to be said the club here have struggled to keep pace with change and keep the facilities up as you would expect. A modern cricketer expects a great deal, and within this club, while almighty efforts have been made, it hasn't quite got itself there to one-day international standard. However, I know changes are afoot and the playing area is being made bigger, so hopefully it won't be too long before we have that first one-day international at Hamilton Crescent.